It's time to bring you yet another amazing episode. And now, welcome your host.
Go for it now. Pick it
Good
up.
to have you on the show. This is Laabels by Omobola Stephen. I'm the host on Omobola Stephen. On Laabels by Omobola Stephen, we focus on personal development and self-improvement topics, occasioning professionals who are experts and adept in the topics of personal development and self-improvement, offering disruptive Mindshift conversations that is going to pivot the changes you and I need in this side of eternity. Now, we emphasize the importance of embracing personal development and self-improvement in order for us to move from where we are to where we need to be. Now, the bounties and the benefits of embracing our personal development and self-improvement doesn't happen overnight. It's a constant effort that you and I need to put up and always put on in order for us to see these changes. Now, when we yearn for changes to happen in our lives, we must first embrace the changes that life is bringing our way in order for us to see the changes that we truly desire for us. Now, today I will be talking with Richard Becker, who is an author and also a strategic communicator. We will be talking about personal development topics. Thank you, Richard, for joining me on the show.
Oh, thank you. It's really great to be here today. I'm glad that we hooked up and we were able to do this.
Glad to have you on the show and looking forward to a great time as we explore this topic about self-improvement. We like to focus especially on your childhood and how you have been transformed with all the life experiences that you have garnered in the process. Can we begin with that?
Yeah, absolutely, Omobola. So where I started, I was actually born, when I was born, my father died when I was very young. So I was raised for the first 10 years by my grandparents, which kind of separated me and put me in a different class. And I was growing up, we were kind of poor and in the inner city of Milwaukee, and I had some additional struggles because I was born with club feet. So I wasn't able to walk right out. They literally had to put casts on my feet to sort of separate them. And that's sort of when, since we're talking about personality development and labels, that's when those labels really started. So you take a child who's, not in a regular household environment, especially in the 60s, 70s, where that wasn't a common thing. And then you add a handicap and you isolate him and you put him in a poor environment, and you start to be saddled with all these different labels and all these different expectations, which are actually very low. People kind of expect you to fail and not fit in and not be able to do certain things. And I think that's where some of the struggles, that I had as an individual started, was back then out of the box. And eventually, I was reunited with my mother primarily because this entire time I was growing up, my grandmother was dying of cancer. So death was constantly in front of me as a child as well. And I did have a lot of struggles. I tended to lash out as a child because, you're angry when you don't have a father and you're not fitting in and you feel isolated. And since people have low expectations of you, you start to fall into this trap of having low expectations for yourself. For instance, when I was in the third grade, I still had struggles reading. I wasn't, and it's kind of ironic that I'm an author now because I couldn't even read in the third grade. And my grandmother, one of the last things she did was intervene to have me repeat the third grade by moving me to, they got a scholarship for a Catholic school. So for 1 year, they've kind of recast who I was and helped change my identity just enough so I could start to receive the education that I needed to move forward at that point in life. And then when I did move in with my mother, it was sort of an adversarial relationship because she still had bitter feelings toward, even though my father had died, toward him. And she was a young mother, which is why I was being raised by those people, by my grandparents. She had me at 17, which again it's a little bit more common nowadays, unfortunately. But back in the 60s and 70s, that wasn't something that, was accepted at all. And so she was a very young mother. And as a result, I think in some ways, actually, even as I got older, sometimes I felt like I was the parent in the relationship because she, she was younger and just didn't have the experience to suddenly have a 10-year-old child thrust upon her. And their lifestyle was a very different one. So it was like night and day. And because of that, she tried to recast me as a different person other than what the identity that I was already trying to build or just trying to climb out of. And that actually had some, was a little bit damaging in terms of who I was and where I was going to go. And as a result of that, I ended up kind of creating all these. I found myself, especially by the time I hit college or even after college, where I was in this repeating pattern of trying to appease people. And it didn't matter though how people I helped or how many awards I received or how many dollars I earned didn't even impact me. Like I always had to do more because I was never good enough and I always had to try. So even when you win from these kind of environments, you find yourself in this repeating pattern where you're still not good enough and you just keep working until I was probably working 100 hours a week, trying to keep up with everything that was going on in my life. And that's, I think, the damage. I think that's just trying to set that up. That's how these labels can really, you put this stuff on you where you have these expectations, whatever it is that you're not good enough, or you're not, even with athletics, because I started off crippled. It took me a long time before I tried to do anything athletic on a regular basis, or people had low expectations of me, and then you start to do that to yourself. And I think that's kind of like the gist or the setup of how we embrace. In a way, I think another way to put it is, if we're not careful, other people will write our stories. And I always tell my children nowadays, I tell my children today as they're going through life, is that it's really important for us to write our own stories and not let other people do it for us. And I think for most of my life, I had other people writing my stories. And I didn't even have a sense of self or identity to succeed or to succeed in a internal way. Because I was trying to live up to everybody else's expectations, whether they were high or low. Does that
But really, Richard,
our actions to some degree, but sometimes, like in my case, even the actions that I would take, like up to the outside world, everybody thought I was doing wonderful things and I was a wonderful person, I was a successful individual, but internally, I didn't feel that way. And we've actually seen that in the past, like let's say comedian actor Robin Williams, if you're familiar with him. Hopefully your audience is familiar with him. He was a comedian and he always made people laugh, but yet he was somebody who suffered from deep bouts of depression and ultimately committed suicide. So there is that external reflection, what we do on the outside, but then there's also what we feel on the inside. And I think that's what you have to do, is try to align those things to where you can actually learn to accept yourself as who you are, without necessarily just looking at the actions that you have. So you're right in the sense that what we put out is what people will see, but at the same time, we have to allow that to be reflected back so that we can see that we need to let people see, we have to see ourselves as other people see us. Or I'm a little bit, I have a little bit of faith in my case. So I could say, you want to live a life where maybe God, recognize that, see yourself as God would see you, or see yourself as somebody important to you would see you. And that way you can have that reflect back to you to see that that your actions are making a difference and that you are a good person.
but the story that you have shared, your personal journey you shared, at what point did you begin to have a mind shift?
Yeah, so I had two, I would say probably two. I had actually several small mind shifts, but I'm going to focus on two for the purpose of this show, and maybe another one will come to me as I go along. One of the first ones is so when I graduated from college, there were no jobs in the field. Like nobody was hiring a copywriter or an advertising copywriter, or journalist, which is how I was getting my start. And so I ended up finding out that everybody had work though. So I created a company to do freelance work, basically. That's how I started my company. And there came a point with my company between when I founded it in 1991 to the point that I came into 1996, where it was big enough that I needed to incorporate. And that was like one of the first struggles I had, was this idea of, well, do I have to act differently now? Now I'm not a freelance writer, but I'm actually an executive of a company. And I was kind of struggling with that. And I had a friend of mine say, and he actually brought this down to parenting. His name was Keith Sheldon, and he became one of my mentors in my life. And one of the interesting things he said is, you have to stop looking at yourself as these labels where you're not a freelance writer or a president, you're Richard Becker. And people are going to see you as Richard Becker. They're not going to see you as a president or that. And he said, and we talked about this more, and some of the points he said was, like, for instance, he was a strategic communicator, and he said, you know, if I see trash on the floor and I pick it up, I don't suddenly become a trash man. I'm still Keith Sheldon. What I do for a living doesn't make any bit of difference. It's just who I am. And the fact that I would pick up trash on the ground just shows that I'm a conscientious person. And see, so then that's to your point, right? Some of our actions display who we are as people. And I thought that was really kind of an amazing thing. And one of the best things he told me, which actually I ended up using for parenting purposes, is you always have to remember, for instance, is some people, they struggle being a parent because they always have this idea of being the perfect mother or the perfect father. But really, that's not what your children need. They need, in my case, it would be the perfect Richard Becker, or in your case, it'd be the perfect Umbala, right? Your children want you. They don't want the perfect mom or the perfect dad. They don't even know what that is. In their minds, you are that. So that was kind of one thing where he kind of taught me to start shedding the labels, but at the same time, I didn't necessarily, to your point, put me in a position where I could find myself or find that internal self. That came later. And unfortunately for me, because I didn't have like a show like this or people that I could talk to directly, and I was afraid to talk to people because I didn't want to damage my external, even regardless of how I felt, I didn't want to damage my external persona that I would carry forth in the world, of that I was this strong, successful guy, because nobody would ever know that I was suffering with identity crisis or any other kind of issues internally, because that wasn't my outward appearance. And that was actually having cancer. I think when I was diagnosed with cancer, that put me in a position where I could reflect on myself. I remember thinking, and I'm okay now and I'm cancer free, but I remember thinking after I was diagnosed, like just reflecting on my life and saying, you know, have you done enough? And then there were still other things I wanted to do. My kids weren't even grown yet, but at the same time, I kind of asked myself, is like, you know, had I done enough? And I reflected on my life and I went, you know, you've done more than most people. You have to be comfortable with the fact that you've done enough, and that just be yourself. And one of the things that I'm doing now, in fact, which has kind of created this place where I'm in a much happier place. And I stopped working 100-hour a week and chasing award, because I have a lot of awards. I have hundreds of awards. And like before I was 40, I earned every single top award in my community, in my field, including some for community achievement from the Las Vegas Chamber of Commerce, and a very well recognized professional. But I was constantly chasing these things, that I always needed more clients and more of that. But the only thing I didn't have was more time. So I would work these crazy weeks, which possibly aggravated and created this situation where I would get cancer, because you become this chronic stress and things like that you feel. But now I've kind of shifted that, and my whole thinking is different. And I stopped thinking about what I'm doing or what label you want to put on me, or how people perceive me, and just I started focusing on the why I do what I do. And instead of focusing on the what you do, you focus on why. And that was kind of freeing in the fact that I do so many more things now. It allowed me to not just be a successful business person, but to become an author, and to become I just started some acting. So I just started some acting like in November, like 3 months ago. We had this set up before I was an actor, and all of a sudden that's kind of taken off to be successful. But instead of focusing on being an actor or an author or a business communicator or a journalist or all these things that I've done, I just accept myself who I am, Richard Becker. And I do a lot of things, you know. I'm not trying to be a Renaissance man or any other label. I'm just trying to be myself, and I focus on the why, which is, for me, I love to do things that serve people, and I love to do things that advance humankind and make the world a better place. And I think you can do that in a lot of different ways. You can do that by writing books to help show people different outlooks. And you can do that by acting to bring them joy in their hearts. You can do that by giving back to the community, by being a public service. For instance, like right now, I serve on the Parks and Recreation Advisory Commission in my community. And I was recently asked to do something for the state that I live in, the state of Nevada. Something called the Governor's Points of Light Awards, which I'll be talking about possibly chairing that next week. I'm not sure if I'm going to do it yet or not. We're going to see the time commitment, but I'm excited to explore it. The clients that I work with are clients that also align with that vision. So I started to really focus on the why, and the strength that that gave me internally was pretty profound.
So thank you, Richard, for sharing that thought with my audience. So really now, at this point of your life, are you chasing after success or after significance? Which will you rather put in the top list?
Yeah, so I don't chase success anymore. So what happens instead is I find success, and regardless of what I do, even so for 3 years I did some coaching too. My daughter needed a softball coach at her high school, so I stepped in to be the softball coach at her high school, and I took a bunch of girls who didn't know how to play softball, and by their 3rd year they finished, fourth in their state, and they went to state every year, but that was kind of an amazing, miraculous thing that happened. I think you find you instead of chasing success, you just focus on your action and giving 100% of your passion and 100% of your effort into whatever it is you're doing, and the success will follow. So rather than chasing success, I think you just focus on the why you're doing what you're doing, and I think the success follows. Like with acting, I just threw my. So the reason I started doing some acting was in order to promote myself as an author, I had to do a lot more video time. I had to do things like TikTok and YouTube and different things like that. And while I was doing that, I'm like, well, how can I get more comfortable in front of a camera? Well, maybe I could throw my name out there to see if I could do some acting. And so I did that, and I was cast in a part pretty quickly. And I just couldn't believe that. So since November, I've been in 3 films and 3 commercials. And I'm not looking to be Brad Pitt or a famous movie star, but I am finding success in that avenue by just doing one acting bit, a month or two, just sort of to round me out as a person and help me grow as a person. And that in turn helps me do better TikTok videos and better YouTube videos and come on shows like yours and have conversations that might help people. And so it just kind of all works together, and because I'm focusing on the why.
Absolutely. And now your book, which is a thriller, The Third Wheel, what's the inspiration behind it? Can you share?
Yeah, sure. So Third Wheel was my first novel. I had written a book prior to that called 50 States. And then when I was working on a second book, that was going to be another collection of short stories, which is what 50 States was. I came across this character, and I was writing this story that took place in Nevada in the 1980s. And it was called Third Wheel, and it was supposed to be a chapter. But as soon as I wrote that chapter for this next collection of short stories that I was working on, I just knew in my heart that Brady Wilkes, this character, was the one I wanted to pursue. Now, one of the reasons I'm sure was because I immediately connected to Brady Wilkes, because although Brady Wilkes and I are different people, we shared some life experiences. So Third Wheel is a coming-of-age thriller, and it talks about a boy who was originally born in the Midwest. He actually was raised by his grandparents. He's transported to Las Vegas and lives in a blended family with a mother who's a little bit of aggressive and very harsh on him. And as a result of that, since he doesn't have the structure that he needs at home, he ends up developing a structure he finds his structure through a friend group, which unfortunately, because of the time in Las Vegas, it starts to go off. It goes from something very innocent where they play games like Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy games like that were very popular in the 1980s. And he starts to shift his attention into selling drugs and things like that. So that's sort of kind of.
What do you think are the important takeaways in the book that the audience can benefit from?
So, and that's what it is so Brady kind of ends up, it's called Third Wheel because in the friend group, he's sort of like the third wheel of the friend group, right? And so he lets other people, he follows along. And that's actually one of the lessons in the story, right to the point, where he sort of follows along and just goes along with the crowd because he doesn't have a strong sense of self. But there comes a point in the book where the crises that he's being faced with and the consequences of the different actions being taken makes him understand that he needs to take charge of his own life and draw his own path, regardless of the circumstances that he's in, even though he's completely alone, and even though there's nobody to help him. He doesn't have the help at home. He doesn't have the help with the girl that he was hoping to have a relationship with. He doesn't have the help from the friend group, and he really has to navigate this on his own. And I think that's really the transformative part of Third Wheel. That's like one of the transformations of this character, Brady Wilkes, comes from the fact that when you're faced with crisis, sometimes that's what wakes you up to say, hey, I need to take charge of my life. And hopefully sometimes it doesn't work for people, but it does to some degree for, well, you have to read the book, but to some degree for Brady Wilkes. And we'll just see if there's not too many consequences that he can't overcome, by the end of it. And the same thing, I think.
All right, so good to know. Thanks for sharing that with my audience. Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any exciting news aside the book projects that you have? Any project you think is going to be beneficial to the audience, you can share now. And now we can connect with you via your social media handles and your website.
Yeah, so what I've been doing is I've been doing a lot more interviews as well, and I do tend to talk about this stuff. So there's some articles that people can look up about that I've done, and interviews that I've done online. I've talked about things like so what I do is not only do I write books like Third Wheel, and I'm working on another book right now, and I am taking on some more acting gigs and growing my business at the same time. So I'm doing all these things, but at the same time, I'm also doing interviews, and I do tend to tie in some of the things that I write about in books. I tie that into the conversations that I have when I do interviews like this. So in Third Wheel, that's a good one about identity crisis, and I've actually talked about that in a number of articles. If people looked up, Richard Becker and identity crisis, or they'd find a pretty lengthy article about that. I also talked about being an introvert and how you can succeed just being an introvert, because that was one of the consequences of my life experiences, kind of made me an introvert, and what that means to people. So I think for your audience, that would be the most beneficial things. And then in the future, when I do other books, even though it's fiction, I tend to use those as talking points and catalysts to sort of move forward and help people out. And then the other thing I'm kind of playing around with right now is I'd love to do something in education where we can take people, and I do draw this a little bit from my life, is to let children embrace reading and find the joy of reading early on, so that they become lifelong readers, because that can have a dramatic impact on your life. If it wasn't for some of the books I was exposed to when my life changed, and I had a couple of teachers intervene and show me that reading was a wonderful thing, I might not have been where I am today. Books open up not only knowledge, but they give you perspective into other people's lives, even if they're fictional characters.
Can you share your social media handles on your website so we can connect and learn more about you?
Sure. You can usually find me on any social media site as either Rich Becker or Richard R. Becker. One of the easiest ways to find me would be to go to bio.site, so bio site/Richard R. Becker. And you can find all my social media handles there, because I am just about on anything. You can find me on YouTube, Twitter, Threads now, right? There's so many, right? Blue Sky. And it's really, they can find me anywhere. And I'm happy to engage on any kind of conversation or a different level. And if somebody is struggling, if they're struggling with labels or self-identity, I'd be happy to have a conversation with them to help them, find a better path for themselves and get comfortable with themselves, so that they can have a well-worth life that they want.
Thank you so much, Richard Becker. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on today's show, especially sharing your childhood struggles. And now you're able to find the leeway at the end of the day. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, and also letting us know about your thriller, your book, The Third Wheel, which is out. And we're looking forward to learning more about your book and how it can inspire the audience of Laabels by Omobola Stephen. We sincerely wish you best of luck in all of the projects that you embark upon, Richard.
All right. Thank you so much for having me today. It was just a wonderful show.
If you'd like to catch up with any episodes of Laabels by Omobola Stephen, you can do so on any cross-promotion platforms or any podcast distribution platforms you bump into online, and do have a great time as you listen to profound insights from experts and professionals who are adept in the topics of personal development and self-improvement. I need you to always stay safe. I talk to you soon. Thank you so much once again, Richard. That was a great show.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thanks so much. You take care.
Yeah, sure.
If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you subscribe and leave us a review.